Okay, so let me start breaking down the story of Reconstruction. After the Civil War, much of the Southern economy was destroyed. Of course, the bulk of the wealth of the white South was in the bodies of slaves, something along the lines of $4 billion, 1860 dollars. Someone once said that the freeing of slaves, the expropriation of slaves from white slaveholders, was the biggest expropriation of private property in all of human history up until the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. So suddenly now the economy of the South was ruined. The land laid untended. Much of the land had been fought over. There were major casualties. 1 out of 4 or so Southern whites, males between the ages of, say, 15 and 50, was killed and wounded during the Civil War. But most significantly, the greatest asset of Southern whites, African American slaves, was now gone. Especially with the passage of the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery in the United States forever. So that's the situation that we have. Let me give you a quick aside, though, and you're not going to get tested on this. The South doesn't really recover from the Civil War or begin to recover from the Civil War until the 1940s, until about World War II. And that's when the government started spending a great deal of money in southern states, especially defense spending. So the South goes during the Civil War from the wealthiest region of the United States, although certainly not everybody in the South was wealthy, especially slaves, to the poorest region of the United States within a 5-year period. And this is what Sam Houston had warned against. This is why Sam Houston had been opposed to secession. He saw what was going to happen, and he turned out to be right. So the question now would be, what punishment would come to the rebellious southern states and Confederate leaders? Would they have to pay a penalty for re-entry into the Union? How would the South be rebuilt? Would it be rebuilt along the same state lines? What would be the status of Southerners, both white and South? For instance, would African Americans be given the right to vote? And remember, this is a period in which African Americans didn't have the right to vote in most northern states. Blacks were not, pardon me, did not have the right to vote in Illinois, Lincoln's home state, in 1865. So certainly it's not a racial paradise. In fact, in Illinois, if you were a free African American and you wanted to go to Illinois, move to Illinois, you had to post a bond of, in today's money, somewhere along the lines of $20,000 to guarantee your behavior. And of course, really it was about keeping African Americans out of Illinois. That's what this was for. So it's not like the North was welcoming to African Americans. So the question would be, okay, what would be the political rights granted these ex-slaves in these southern states in a country where almost no African Americans, slave or free, before 1865 had significant political rights or rights to serve on juries, that kind of a thing. The other question would be, would white Southerners, would Confederate officials, would they be denied the right to vote? Would this be part of the punishment for participating in leaving the Union, leaving the Union because of the results of a lawful election in 1860? Would there be any punishment? Would whites lose suffrage? No one knew. These were open questions in 1865. And the big question is that to what extent, how would ex-slaves be integrated into society, into an American society that was deeply racist? Remember, Abraham Lincoln, as late as 1863, He's urging African American leaders to begin colonization projects outside of the United States because he did not believe that African Americans would ever exist in an equal way in the United States. Now, he changes his tune by the time he's assassinated, but for most of his life, this is what Lincoln's thinking was. So what would be the integration of African Americans, ex-slaves, into society? Now, this was a question in the South, of course, but it was also a question in the North, where many white workers, especially wage workers in northern cities, were extremely frightened at the thought of freed slaves coming up into places like New York or Philly or Cincinnati, Chicago, and taking wage labor, day labor jobs away from white, especially white immigrant workers. So just a huge amount of questions, political, moral, social, in the period after the Civil War. Now, Lincoln, let's talk about Lincoln just a little bit. And we have the glimmers of what he was thinking. Remember, Lincoln, in the context of the 1860s, was a moderate Republican. He was an incrementalist. You know very well that he moved towards emancipation very slowly, and once he got there, he didn't change his mind. But he certainly was not a fire-breathing abolitionist. And throughout the Civil War, Lincoln is thinking about the war when it's over, and how the South would be brought back into the Union. And I would say it's fair to claim about Lincoln that in thinking about the post-war period, he's thinking much more about Southern whites than he is about the freed slaves. Certainly, he thinks about the free slaves to some extent, but remember, it's very unclear if these free slaves are going to have the right to vote, and initially they don't, right? Even after emancipation, ex-slaves don't have the right to vote. And so what Lincoln is thinking, he's thinking more about Southern whites. He's trying to think about easing them back into the Union. And I talked about this in an earlier podcast. He's hoping, kind of against hope, that maybe he can persuade a portion of Southern whites to join the Republican Party. Because this is the dilemma and the irony of the Union victory, the victory of the North in the Civil War, that at some point, probably, the Southern states are going to come back into the Union, but these Southern states are dominated by the Democratic Party. And so the ironic aspect of the Union victory is that at some point it's going to dilute the power of the Republican Party. The Republican Party had dominated Washington during the Civil War because of the states that had, I think it's 11, that had left the Union. Well, now these 11 states are going to come back into the Senate, into the House of Representatives, and the power of the Republican Party, its control over Washington, D.C., is going to be fairly diluted. So Lincoln is thinking hard about how he can gain at least a portion of the vote of Southern whites. Now, it's very unclear if this would have ever been possible. Southern whites, of course, were angry at the defeat, demoralized. Lincoln had led the crusade against them. So even a political genius like Lincoln, it's very hard to see how he would have been successful in gaining the support of some Southern whites, or at least a significant portion of Southern whites. And this is why I've said in class a couple of times that Lincoln's assassination, as tragic as it is, it did take him off the stage at a time period where he didn't have to deal with these really insanely complicated questions in the post-Reconstruction period that, frankly, there may have been no answer for. And that's the hard fact about Reconstruction. There were issues around Reconstruction that there were no answers for, or the answers that were available. U.S. society was not there yet. Let's talk about, say, full equality for African Americans. Well, most whites were racist at this point in history. And I'm talking about northern whites as well. And southern whites, it hardly needs to be said that they're deeply racist. So Lincoln would have had to deal with problems that were completely intractable, and even a great political genius like him, I think, would have really struggled with these issues. So he does have a plan, though, and we know about this because he starts thinking about this in 1863, right about the time that the North has recaptured significant parts of the Confederacy. Remember, the North captured Tennessee pretty early in the war. The North captured New Orleans in southern Louisiana pretty early in the war. So as the Union Army is marching, and then after Vicksburg, the North captures Mississippi. So the North is recapturing southern territory. And so Lincoln comes up with a plan. And his plan was very, very moderate. He would pardon every white Southerner who took a loyalty oath to the Union. So all you had to do to get a pardon was just sign this oath saying that you would now be loyal to the Union. You'd been disloyal, but now you're loyal. And this was true of Confederate officials as well. So Lincoln is not thinking about any kind of retribution, mass executions, war trials, anything of the sort. He wants to bring the white South back into the Union in as gentle and as peaceful a way as possible. One general asked Lincoln how Southerners should be treated, and Lincoln said, let them in easy, let them in easy. So Lincoln, he's magnanimous and all that kind of stuff. He's not a vengeful person, but he's also very political as well. And then the other part of Lincoln's plan was that any state in which 10% of its voters in the 1860 election took the loyalty oath, so let's say Tennessee now. So what you would find out is how, let's say 100,000 people voted in the 1860 election. Lincoln would have made it where only 10,000 needed to sign this loyalty oath because it's only 10% of the number that voted in 1860. And if that 10% signed the loyalty oath, then the state would be able to form a new government and write a new constitution. And that's what would get you back into the Union. Now, the one thing that Lincoln demanded was that any new constitution that states wrote as they attempted to come back into the Union, Confederate states, would have to abolish slavery in recognition. They'd have to recognize the abolition of slavery. That was non-negotiable for Lincoln. So Lincoln's plan was very, very mild. Again, only 10% of voters in the 1860 election, if they took a loyalty oath, then that state would be allowed to call a convention, write a new constitution that prohibited slavery, and at that point, according to Lincoln, that state could come back into the Union. But Lincoln's plan was considered much too mild by his political opponents in Washington, the so-called radical Republicans. They want a much harsher regime in the South than does Lincoln. You could either say they're much more vengeful, or, that's one way to look at it. Radical Republicans don't have a good reputation. The United States is not comfortable with radicals. But it's the radical Republicans that are the ones that are pushing for programs to help the ex-slaves, to give ex-slaves political rights, to kind of open up society's doors for ex-slaves. So even though radical Republicans have a bad reputation, they actually tried to do some great things during and after the Civil War. But for our purposes, all you need to know is they stopped Lincoln's so-called 10% plan. They stopped it cold. It never went anywhere because they felt like it was much too mild, and it didn't guarantee any protections for African Americans. So Lincoln, if he'd had his way, would have been quite easy on the white South. in the post-war period.